What do you mean? You can record through Zoom. Yeah, there you go.
Did you guys get that notification that it's like recording? Okay, cool.
Awesome.
Oh, that's so genius. That's like 15 points right then and there.
You're welcome.
On video.
You guys see that?
Yeah.
Can you hear it?
No.
You can't hear it?
Mm-mm.
I hate AUX.
Can you hear it now?
No. Wait. Okay, well, while we figure this audio situation out, hi everyone, welcome to our second meeting of the semester. So glad that you all are here. We just have a few administrative things to kind of go over, and then we are watching the Angela Davis speaker event that KPU and the Women's Initiative is putting on. Super fun. But first I wanted to ask if anyone had any questions or comments or concerns before we get started. Just a little like unmute your mic because I can't see everyone right now. Or put it in the chat too is also. All right, no questions. Okay, so a few administrative things that we kind of just wanted to go over once I can figure out how my screen works. Okay, so if you guys would like to write for our print magazine, please email me or Maggie, and we can get you set up for everything. For anyone that has already communicated with me that you would like to write for our print magazine, please just put your name and your article, idea, thought, title, whatever, into our editorial calendar under the collegiate tab, just so that we can kind of keep tabs on what people are writing about so that our design team can start designing content for the magazine. Does anyone have any questions about print? I know that it's like super confusing since like for our new writers, like what's the difference between online and print? I try my best to explain it, but over email it's kind of hard. So does anyone have any questions right now? Great. If you do have questions, feel free to email me, Maggie, any of the print editors. All of our information is on the contact info tab in the editorial calendar just to make life easier for you guys. If you are taking, if you are participating in the themed content week, which our amazing editor Emma has been so diligently working on, the articles are due, they were due today, but let's say Saturday. So if you want to write about anything related to the 2020 election, please feel free to write about it. You'll get double incentive points and it'll be published this upcoming week. If you have any questions about the themed content week, please email me or Emma. We would be happy to answer any questions. Does anyone have any comments, questions, concerns about themed content week? Okay, so,
Can I test if you guys can hear this?
Yeah.
All right, I'm resuming.
So again, we only have 45 minutes,
You can
and
hear it?
believe me,
Yeah.
we could.
Awesome.
I
Okay,
could
do you
go
have
on
more
and
things to
talk to
go
you
over?
for a
Sorry.
long
Like two
time.
more
So I want to get
things,
as
and then
much
we'll
as
go
I can in our 45 minutes that we.
Okay, really fast. We're sending out a feedback form in our newsletter. So if you guys have any general things you want to let us know and you want it to be anonymous or not anonymous, please fill that out. It'll be in our newsletter. Our main forum for communication with you guys is really email. So please make sure that you're checking those on a regular basis for emails from us. Our writer of the week is something that we do every week, and the editorial team picks one of the articles that we think are really wonderful. And it was really hard this week because we had so much wonderful content from you guys. So thank you so much for writing literally so well. But this week's writer of the week is Santa Momtani for her article, Gender Reveals Dangerous in More Ways Than One. Is she here? I cannot tell. I don't think so. But yay, congrats, Santa. You're literally amazing. Love your articles. And then I also just wanted to update you guys on who our bronze level writers are. It's just if you've written one article, that's bronze, and then 5 articles is silver, so on and so forth. So this week's bronze writers were Gianna, Simi, Gigi, Margaret, Robin, Lisa, Tiffany, and Hannah Richards. So you guys are awesome. Great content. You guys will be highlighted on our social media pages tomorrow. Keep up the wonderful work. You guys are the best. If I'm pronouncing your name wrong, please let me know. And then, does anyone have any questions before we watch this event? Awesome. Okay. If you guys don't want to watch the whole event, you can leave at any time or whatever you guys.
And if you have questions, like message them in the chat and I'll like officially submit them.
Yeah, because Abby's watching this like live right now and then is like sharing her screen with us.
All right, ready?
Yeah.
The pandemic and the shelter-in-place order that
can you see it now?
Caused us to rely on electronic modes of communication. And when we saw the videos of the Ahmaud Arbery killing in Georgia, and then afterwards the video of the last minutes of George Floyd's life as he uttered Eric Garner's words, "I can't breathe," while the knee of a white police officer was pressing unrelentingly on his neck, it seems to me that we were transformed into the unwilling audience of a lynching. And of course, lynchings recall the crowds that gathered for judicial executions. And as if to challenge the easy assumption that Black lives that are extinguished by state violence, by racist state violence, are exclusively male, we also learned during the same period about the police murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. And I mention these events because it seems to me that even those who were not aware of the histories of lynchings and these historical connections, they must have felt the surge of these histories and recognized at some level that this was a moment when we had to at least try to interrupt these acts of racism. Who would have ever imagined that the largest anti-racist demonstrations in the country would occur under these conditions, when we knew that leaving our homes and gathering in large groups would expose us to the virus. But not only did people pour out into the streets all over the country, but people rose up all over the world. And I should say, although it was primarily in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, that it was also about colonialism and slavery and capitalism, or racial capitalism, to use Cedric Robinson's term, that have created the trajectory that has led us to this point. And in that sense, we are connected to people all around the world who have also seized upon this occasion to engage in dramatic opposition to racism.
Yeah, I mean, and you're so right. This movement was quite different than any others because the diverse makeup composition of the protests. What do you think of? You know, we talk about intersectionality a lot now. It's a term that we use, Kimberly Crenshaw's term, for the fact that there are multiple oppressions. Do you think that this for the protest was that multiple oppressions, and when we talk about gender and sexual identity and class, and do you think that was also playing out at this time?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that that Black feminists, women of color feminists, have always been talking about what we now know as intersectionality. We can go all the way back to Anna Julia Cooper at the end of the 19th century. So I think it's important to use the term intersectionality, but to recognize that, that it is rooted in struggle, and that in the 1970s, there was the Third Women's Alliance, who talked about triple jeopardy. That was the name of their newspaper, Triple Jeopardy: racism, sexism, imperialism. And then, of course, there was the Combahee River Collective, and their statement in 1977 called for what they termed integrated analysis against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. And so I do think that the notion of intersectionality of struggles is perhaps even more important than intersectionality of identities. And we're still pushing for that. I don't think that this is the way we automatically perceive social reality. As a matter of fact, in many instances, racism tends to take over. And of course, racism is the original sin of this country, however you want to put it. But I think we still tend to think in masculinist terms. This is why it was so important that at least we have this example of a Black woman who had also been killed by the police during this period. Tony McDade, a trans man who was killed by the police. But I think that we continue to struggle to perceive and apprehend within intersectional frameworks. We have to remind ourselves that the struggle is also about Black women's liberation. It's about Black non-binary people's liberation. It's about the liberation of us all. And so I think the feminist dimension that has come to social justice struggles largely through Black Lives Matter is something that we have to insist upon. I should tell you that I'm trying to finish a book right now, which I'm writing with 3 of my comrades and colleagues, which is called Abolition Period, Feminism Period, Now Period. And the point is now that abolition is moving into popular discourse, we don't want the feminism to be left out. And feminism, not just because of its concern with gender, but also because of the methodological approaches, the mandate from intersectional feminism that we look at connections, that we look at relationships and interrelationalities, intersectionalities.
Mm-hmm. So how do you answer to those people that say, given all of, these different dimensions of people, that all lives should matter? Why do we say Black Lives Matter? How do you answer to that? How do you respond?
Well, I think that people are beginning to understand the logic of saying Black Lives Matter. You may remember when Hillary Clinton, wow, it seems like it was ages ago, but it was only about 4 years ago, right?
Right. It seems like forever ago, right? A lifetime.
It does. And so I can remember she responded to the call Black Lives Matter with all lives matter. And I mean, I've often talked about the kind of tyranny of the universal that gets invoked here, because when one seeks to replace Black Lives Matter with all lives matter, then Black people get subsumed in a way that disappears the particularities of anti-Black racism and racism directed toward other groups as well. So this is why I like to talk about the tyranny of the universal. All men are created equal. Well, at least they did say all men. They didn't say all people. Had they said all people, they would have meant men. Right. But even saying all men didn't mean all men. It meant white men, and not even all white men. It meant affluent and property-owning white men. So we see the ways in which the categories we use fail to grasp realities. Now, there's a different way of thinking about all lives matter, thinking about that universal concept. And that is going through the particular Black Lives Matter to reach a more robust, a more meaningful, general concept. Because it seems to me that the real underlying meaning of Black Lives Matter is this. When Black lives matter, that will finally mean that all lives matter.
Right.
And so it's not exclusive saying Black Lives Matter. We don't say only Black Lives Matter. And I don't understand why people tend to interpret that as an exclusive proposition. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's always been the case with Black struggles. Black struggles have represented liberation for everyone, not only Black people, poor white people. And I'm thinking about the amazing campaign for education in the aftermath of the Civil War, when Black people fought to have the right to learn, fought for public education, when public education did not exist in the South. And when they won, that meant that public education was also available to poor white children who, prior to that, did not have the right to education. I think that perhaps is the best example of the ways in which struggles around social justice for Black people always bring victories that involve everyone.
Mm-hmm. That's I think that's so helpful for our audience, and especially our students who are really active in the Black Lives Matter movement, to hear how to respond to that. And what would you, thinking about your involvement with the Black Panther Party in the 60s, 70s, and the Black Lives Matter movement now, what would you tell some of our students that are actively, are activists, and they are, in the midst of the struggle? What advice would you give them? And how do you see the similarities of the two movements? Or do you see a similarity?
Well, I do see similarities, but very important differences as well. When we were active as young people in the late 1960s and the early 70s, we were responding to a particular set of conditions. And we also had a particular set of theories and ideas and vocabularies. So in many ways, we were restricted because we didn't know then what we know now. But at the same time, there was this passionate desire to create a better world, not only for Black people, but for all people. It's important that people acknowledge that during that period, there were revolutions happening all over the world. There was the Cuban Revolution. There were African liberation movements. There was the struggle in Vietnam. And so if one looks at the work that was done by organizations like the Black Panther Party. I was involved in the Black Panther Party. I was active in Los Angeles SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I was a member of the Communist Party that had an internationalist perspective. And so we wanted an end to racism, and we also wanted socialism. We hadn't yet figured out how to involve issues of gender holistically in the approach, although we did talk about women's rights, certainly. But many of us thought that the feminists who were active at the time, who were largely white and middle class, were not revolutionary. They were assimilationists, we thought. They wanted to have a piece of the existing pie. They didn't want to reorganize society. They wanted to penetrate the ceiling so that they could participate in the leadership of existing society. Mm-hmm. And so it was really exciting. And of course, I don't think this moment would have been enabled without those struggles in the 60s, the civil rights struggles in the 50s and the 60s, the Black liberation movement struggles in the 60s and 70s. But there's some really important differences between the struggle today. And in many ways, it's really a privilege to be associated with these new movements that have learned so much from the movements of the past, but are not beholden to them, but are doing new things, new visions. And this is why I always say that as a person who is now, of course, an elder, I find myself learning so much from the younger generation as they use the work that we did and the ideas that we developed to move toward the future. But it's very exciting. And let me just give you one example, which I like to talk about, and that's the very notion of leadership. Nobody contested the fact that leadership of social justice movements, particularly in Black communities, would inevitably consist of individual, a Black charismatic male individual. In the first place, it was individualistic. It was about, there were no women who held those positions. Even though women were doing the most essential work, even though women were responsible for the movements, the spokespersons, were always the men. And so now, over the last 5 or 6 years, the new generation of activists, Black Lives Matter activists, talk about collective leadership, feminist notions of leadership. And they reach back to those who have been marginalized in the past. They reach back to Ella Baker, who pointed out that So they say that we are a leaderful movement, and we do not need to have the single Black male charismatic figure at the head of the movement.
And that is a change, right?
Very much so.
Very much so. I mean, just, hearing you talk, I think I told you I've been reading your autobiography, and the fact that you were born in Birmingham, some people called it, in the civil rights movement. And how did that shape, coming from, as you talk about that movement, having men in the forefront of the movement, did your growing up years in Birmingham shape some of your thoughts, though, making that transition from the 60s civil rights movement to the 70s? What was that like?
Well, I think that I am who I am, and my commitment to this struggle is what it is as a result of having grown up in Birmingham, Alabama. I don't think I could imagine my own personal or political trajectory except as having its origin in the segregated life of Black people in Birmingham. And I should tell you that both my parents were born and grew up in rural Alabama. My mother I grew up in a place called Sylacauga. She was a foster child. My father grew up in Marengo County. And my mother it's a long story. If I had the time,
we could go on for a long time.
I can tell you that, my mother basically ran away from home because she wanted to go to school.
Wow.
There was only one high school for Black people in the entire state of Alabama.
Wow.
And so she and her foster parents thought that once she graduated from elementary school, she should get a job and help support the family. But she wanted to study. So she literally ran away from home, went to Birmingham, got a job as a domestic worker, got a room at the YWCA, and she went to high school. Wow. And from there, she was supported and went to college. My father was supported by the Episcopal Church. He grew up under impoverished circumstances in rural Alabama, and he eventually ended up going to St. Augustine's College in Raleigh, North Carolina, because of his involvement with the Episcopal Church. And my mother and father met because of my mother's activism. My mother was involved in an organization called the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which people don't know a great deal about because a lot of the members of that group were Black communists. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the main figures. But I remember being extremely aware of the limitations of our lives and the conditions of white supremacy. My mother told us, and I've said this over and over again, from the time we were very young, and we asked, why can't we go to the amusement park? Or why can't we go to the museum? Or, why is the Black library full of tattered books? Or, why is our school this way and the white schools? And she would always say, this is not the way things are supposed to be. And we're struggling to change them. And one day they will be different. So she said this over and over and over again, which gave us children the capacity to sort of live under those conditions and at the same time inhabit a future, a different future. And I don't know if ever I imagined that things would always be the way they were. And I'm so thankful to that, for that, because I think I carry that message with me. And I always say, well, this is why I decided to study critical theory, because critical theory is precisely about not assuming that which is will always be, precisely because of the fact that it exists.
Right. And what a wonderful lesson even for parenting today, that although there is the struggle and the pain, there's also the joy and the understanding to be critical thinkers, and that there is you are empowered to make change. That's a pretty powerful statement. We are getting short on time, and we could talk for a long time. And there's so much that we could unpack with what you're talking about. But I wanted to ask you something that is really personal to us here at American University. Dr. Ibram Kendi, who founded our AU Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, and actually wrote his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, while here. And many of us on campus, faculty, staff, and administrators, this summer after George Floyd's murder, we recommitted ourselves, especially in the School of Education, on creating an anti-racist academic community. I want you to just give us, first of all, how you define anti-racism, because this is a question that I'm always asked by my people. So what is anti-racism really? People are very critical of the fact that it's anti-something, and I hear that a lot. So I want to know a little bit about how you define it. What does it entail? And how would you propose that we go about becoming an anti-racist university? I mean, what would that mean? I mean, you spent a lot of time on university campuses, so you know all the policies and the structures in higher education. What are some of your thoughts about that? What do you tell? I really want to know, because we are really we are putting effort into making this really happen for us. So would love to hear your ideas.
Well, first of all, we're all so thankful for Ibram Kendi's work. It's almost as if he had the prescience to recognize that we would experience something like this current moment, and people would have to have conceptual tools. They would have to be able to engage in these analyses. So I really thank him. Every time I see him, I really enjoy engaging him, and his commitment is so powerful.
Yes.
And I think that for a long time, people who wanted to distance themselves from racism, white people especially, would always say, "I'm not a racist." And that refrain, "I am not a racist," we heard over and over again. And then sometimes people would make racist statements, and they would say, "I don't know where that came from. I'm not a racist. Why did I say that?" And of course, inevitably, they would be instructed to attend an unlearning racism workshop or whatever, as if the way to end racism is simply to change people's attitudes and behaviors. And so I think that the notion of becoming an anti-racist is framed precisely in order to challenge this notion that one can not be a racist. All of us have been influenced by racism and racist ideologies, regardless of our racial backgrounds. And of course, as Ibram Kendi points out in his work, as a Black man, he was also profoundly influenced by racist ideas. So there's a difference between simply saying, "I'm not a racist, I didn't own slaves, I never did anything to hurt Black people, my best friend is Black," all of those statements, and actually recognizing the structural, systemic dimension of racism and making a commitment to end that, to end the structures of racism. And I think this moment is so important because we are witnessing a popular recognition of the structural and systemic character of racism. Finally, after people have been saying this for decades and decades, Finally now the TV journalists are saying it.
They're actually saying it, using the words, right, and saying
exactly,
that's racist.
Exactly.
Right.
And using the words white supremacy. And,
right.
After all, during the Obama administration, we were supposed to have reached this post-racial era, right? We were supposed to be beyond racism. But I think that, first of all, easy solutions, have to be challenged and deeply questioned, because there are no easy solutions to this question of trying to end racism. And I've said many times that right now we've finally begun a process that should have happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery. And Du Bois wrote about this. It's a whole notion of abolition democracy, about not simply releasing people from their chains, but transforming society in such a way that would allow for the egalitarian incorporation of former slaves. And I say this, and I listen to your question very carefully. What can academic institutions do, and other institutions? And I think, first of all, don't assume that simply by establishing a diversity and inclusion office, that's the answer. See, people are always looking for easy solutions. And so the ease with which diversity and inclusion entered into the mainstream, every university campus has a diversity and inclusion office or something like that, right?
Right. Or a chief diversity officer, right?
Yeah, a chief diversity
And it's one person can fix it.
Yes. And so I always ask, well, okay, that's good. Diversity is good. And inclusion is good. But what about justice? What about transformation? Are you going to simply diversify and engage in policies of inclusion within structures that remain exactly the same as they were when they were responsible for the lack of diversity and for exclusion? So, and that's hard work.
That's difficult.
So it's about looking at the entire institution, looking not only looking at the administration and the faculty and the students and the curriculum, but also it's about looking at the workers. It's about looking at the janitors. It's about recognizing that in order for this institution to become an anti-racist institution, its structures will have to be completely transformed. Mm-hmm. And that is going to take a long time. But I think we can embark on that path now. And this is the moment, this moment of crisis, this conjuncture that was created by the convergence of the pandemic and these dramatic representations of Black lynching. And so I think that the process is going to be a long one, and I wish you all the success.
I'll come back to you and tell you how we're doing with that, because I agree it's not easy. I'm going to my last question, and then I know we have to get to the student questions. It's about change of another type of institution that you've talked a lot about. And I've really admired how you amplified the voices of the most vulnerable, and one being the incarcerated. And, with our recent, conversations about building walls and border control and mass incarceration, can you talk about your thoughts on, the prison industrial complex, which you've written a lot about, And, how does that fit into our notion of democracy? It goes back to what you were just saying about higher education. It's similar. It's a parallel sort of conversation. What would be your advice to those who are also concerned about the prison industrial complex now, and where do we need to go next? Just sort of your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, I think it might be important to point out that the prison industrial complex is one of the most dramatic examples of structural racism. Structural racism in relation to the histories of punishment and the fact that the penitentiaries in this country are very much connected to the modes of punishment that developed during slavery and in the aftermath of slavery, and largely in the aftermath of slavery, because and policies and practices of incarcerating Black people, because it's interesting, if one looks at the existing prisons around the time of the Civil War in the South, the majority of the prisoners before the Civil War were white. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, in places like Mississippi, I think the penitentiary, the population shifted to become something like 95% Black. So it's very clear that these institutions emerged as a mode of managing Black people and Black labor, free Black, quote, free Black people. And at the same time, the recent surge in the population, the Black and brown populations in prisons, have to do with global capitalism and have to do with the extent to which the rise of global capitalism not only caused deindustrialization, which meant that Black people are always the last hired and the first fired. So you had no one to make a living. And then at the same time, with the neoliberal ideas about problems all being related to the individual, that is to say, the government and society shouldn't have the responsibility for assisting those who are impoverished or assisting with healthcare. So all of these institutions were dismantled. Welfare was dismantled. Free healthcare. It used to be possible for anybody to go to any hospital and be treated. And now hospitals are privatized under the impact of global capitalism. And this is also the reason why so many people are on the move, leaving their countries of origin, because their economies have been rendered untenable for them. And so you have the same kinds of conditions that cause people to want to come to this country from places like Central America, that are also responsible for the incarceration of so many Black people. And therefore, it's complicated, but I think that we have a responsibility of conveying these complex relationships to people, to the community. And I always say that people in colleges and universities, students and faculty, aren't the only ones who think. They aren't the only ones who have the capacity to think in difficult terms, right? So I think that the movement against the prison industrial complex, which began, I would say, around the mid-1990s, create an arena for what we are experiencing today. when we began to argue that it's not possible to reform prisons because they are so deeply steeped in racism and classism, and the fact is that the vast majority of people who commit crimes don't even go to prison, especially if we look in the direction of where you are in Washington,
down the street.
But recognizing that the problems that have led to the vast numbers of people behind bars are problems of health care, physical health care, mental health care. They're problems of education, the lack of access to education. They're problems of a lack of institutional commitment to people who have trouble making ends meet, poor people. And so the way to address the problems in prisons is not by saying, let's reform the prisons. The way to do it is recreating the social conditions that are responsible for these institutions. And so the idea of abolition emerged in that context. And rather than interminably calling for reforms that end up making prisons more permanent and oftentimes even more repressive than they were before, why can't we imagine new ways of addressing harm? And the same kinds of arguments hold true for police. Instead of over and over again asking for the removal of particular police officers because they have problems with racism or a particular policy within the police department. I mean, we spent decades and decades trying to make police better and better, and they've gotten worse and worse. And so therefore, the argument for abolition holds true for law enforcement as well, and revisioning, reconceptualizing the ways in which security and safety are guaranteed for us in this society. So I think this is where we are now.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking, as an educator, thinking about in education settings in schools, we replicate those same systems in schools. I mean, the expulsions and the suspensions, and we talk about reforming education when we're not changing anything. We're just, the structure has to change.
Yeah,
all right,
absolutely.
It is absolutely.
And let me just say that we often incorporate those retributive impulses in our own relations with other people.
Right.
Because what does the criminal justice system do? It punishes, it gets back, it acts in a retributive way towards those who have allegedly committed crimes. And we have the same impulses in our emotions. Somebody does something bad to us, and our first response is, well, let me get back at them.
Right.
Let me do the same thing to them.
Right.
Let me imprison them. Let me, whatever.
Right.
So I think you're right. It's
embedded in our society.
Yes.
Exactly. It is so embedded. I'm going to move to a question, Professor Davis, from our students for a Just Society. And this is a good segue. They said, how can we handle feeling discouraged or doubt in the pursuit of action?
Hey, Abby, did it end? Abby is not. Oh, she just texted me 1 second. Oh, her computer died. Well, does anyone have like any comments about that at all that they would like to share? For me personally, that was super interesting to hear. She's been one of like my personal icons for as long as I can remember. So that was really cool to hear her talk. One of the quotes that she said that really stuck out to me was, what was it? I wrote it down. It was diversity and inclusion is great, but what about justice? So that really made me think of how we can implement like actual anti-racist policies into the framework of society and the institutions that we live in to try and right all of the wrongs that the Black community has suffered through all this time. That was just my like favorite part of the event. Does anyone else have anything they want to add at all?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. She mentioned in the very beginning, she was talking about like the structure of the movements and the differences between the current movements and the movements from the 60s and the 50s. And I just thought it was interesting how she was talking about the women, how like the structure of organization within women of those movements was so different from like the one charismatic Black man, and how we're seeing that come into play right now. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that's a great point. Love that. Abby just rejoined. Let's.
Hi. Do you want to keep talking about it, or do you want me to try to get it back on?
Was it over, or did they have like questions or something?
I think they're still talking. Why isn't she?
Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add at all? Abby's going to write an article about it, so if you would like to help her co-write the article or write another one, please feel free. That was a really cool event. Angela Davis is a badass. Love her. Kind of switching gears super fast. Does anyone have any like writing related questions that they would like to have answered at all? Or event related questions or social media related questions or any point of clarification that we can provide for you? Because I know we threw a lot of information at you guys like the last meeting that we had. And sometimes the site isn't very intuitive to navigate. All right. Abby, do you have anything?
Nope. I mean, it's still going on if you want me to just like pop on, and then you guys can feel free to just like come in and out as you want, but
yeah, we can do that. That's good.
Oh, can you make me a host again?
Oh, yeah. Okay, just did it.
What I do now will matter. It will matter for people 100 years from now who will be looking back on this period and who will be thanking those who stood up and fought back and attempted to begin the process of eliminating racism.
Yeah, that piece about self-care that you're talking about, that's a part of the struggle too, right? Is that building community, but also looking after ourselves in the struggle, which is very hard for some to do.
Well, this is also the feminist dimension.
That's what I was going to say for women. I mean, yes, that exactly. And for Black women who often, we put ourselves, at risk of so much because we feel as though we have to carry the burden, carry the load without looking after ourselves. So that self-care is so important.
Yes,
so important. What are your thoughts? Just another question came in. What are your thoughts on the current environmental justice movement and its intersectionality to racial justice?
Well, the environmental struggle is the most important struggle. I don't usually like to create hierarchies and to say, oh, it's more important to struggle against racism than it is to struggle against misogyny. I don't do that because they're all connected. And I can say the same thing about the environmental movement, except that if we don't save the planet, if we don't manage to save the planet, then none of the work that we're doing to end racism or misogyny or transphobia or ableism, none of that will matter. And so whatever we're doing, we have to figure out how to make the work that we're doing relevant to efforts to save our environment, to save the planet. I had a wonderful webinar with people in Brazil, in the Amazonas, in the Amazon in Brazil, who, and this was last summer when the fires were blazing there. And of course, they were trying to figure out the connection between the attack on the environment, the attack on indigenous people who live in the Amazon and whose land, whose ancestral land is being burned so that it can be developed by capitalists. And to think about those connections, the connection with struggles against the militarization of the police. To me, this is the meaning of intersectionality, being able to hold these ideas and movements in tension and recognize their interrelationalities. But certainly the movement to save the environment is something that we all have to embrace. Otherwise, there will be no Earth, there will be no future, there will be no future history.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned capitalism many times, and you said that there was one question about how do we become a socialist society? Is that something that you feel is a necessity, that capitalism has to be changed and created a socialist society? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think we need some kind of socialism. And capitalism is not working now. As we see the wealth of the planet increasingly concentrated in ever smaller numbers of people. Jeff Bezos, I think, is the richest man in the world.
Or one of them. I don't know.
One of them. Yeah, I saw an article. That doesn't even matter because, once you get past like millions and people, millions, billions, it makes no sense, especially when people are hungry, especially when people have no homes and people have no food. Why can't that wealth be used to benefit humanity? And capitalism will not allow that. Capitalism runs on profit. And this is why you can have, I don't usually talk about the current occupant of the White House because I think he doesn't deserve recognition. But I will say that when it becomes so apparent that he not only has no empathy for people who are suffering, he doesn't even know how to think about them. He doesn't know how to relate to them. I think he was speaking at a rally the other day and someone asked him, this is the one, what was it in Nevada? The most recent one. Yeah, and there were large numbers of people there. They weren't social distancing. They didn't have on masks. And someone asked him, wasn't he concerned about the situation? And he said, no, I'm quite a distance from them. They're not going to, he could only think about himself. And this is precisely the kind of mindset that capitalism encourages, this this possessive individualism. And we're going to have to figure out how to move to another way of organizing our economies and our social lives. That's just it. It's going to have to happen.
Which is, again, a huge structural change. I mean, that is just, a huge change, because everything around us is built on, as you said, profit, right? And a capitalist foundation. I have so many great questions.
Let me just say that the whole idea that racism is structural and institutional and systemic is, as you said, precisely related to capitalism. It's those capitalist structures, capitalist institutions that we're going to have to question and dismantle.
Right. Which is a part of every institution, whether it be education, criminal justice,
yes.
higher education. It's a part of it all. I'm a little selfish because I'm a dean of a school of education, and I see these questions of students coming out of education school, and they want to really know how can teachers and educators bring this message into classrooms to support Black and Brown students, and the role of education and everything that you're talking about. How do you see education? You've mentioned, and I heard it loud and clear, that even a part of the prison industrial complex, education is a predeterminant of a lot of that. I mean, it's a part of that system. Any advice you have for us as educators and how we can disrupt and create new structures?
I think education is central. Education is absolutely central. While educational institutions are linked to institutions of incarceration, and of course, one can see in the ways in which even elementary schools and high schools have begun to replicate conditions of confinement, with discipline being more important. The school to prison pipeline is a concept that has emerged over the recent period. But education also is the answer to liberation. And I always go back to Frederick Douglass, who pointed out that there can be no liberation without education. And he basically stole an education by tricking white people in to tell him how to spell words and how to read. So and that has always been our hope. But education is not about the learning of facts. People tend to think that education is also about accumulating facts and accumulating ideas, and in a capitalist way, in the way that capitalists accumulate profit. And I always tell my students that I am not so concerned about how much you know in terms of factual information. There's a difference between information and knowledge. And I want to place the emphasis on knowledge. And I also want to place the emphasis on critical engagements and learning how to ask questions, learning how to question not only the difficult issues, not only the textual issues, but learning how to raise questions about the what appears to be the most normal aspects of one's life. So, generally, when something becomes so normal that you don't even question it, that you take for granted, it's just there. That's usually where the problems reside. That's where the problems of racism reside. The assumption of Black inferiority. And I've said many times that I'm so thankful to the trans movement for the way in which they have taught the country how to raise questions about that which appeared to be so absolutely normal that it would remain foundational for all of the other ideas that we have. And to raise questions about gender is precisely to question the normalcy of surrounding conditions. And I think that is what you teach students how to do, how to formulate those questions, how never to be satisfied with what exists simply because it exists. Right. Critical theory.
Critical thinking, right?
Critical
knowledge.
Thinking. Exactly.
Information is not knowledge, and education is liberation.
Yes.
I mean, that's so powerful. So there's some questions here about talking to community members, those who are unfamiliar with abolitionist thought and practice. Any advice about how to talk to community members about police? And this is, I think, a question about, methods of activism, how to go about having those conversations.
Well, first I should point out that the way in which we use abolitionist ideas and strategy today emanates from struggles inside prisons. And while abolition has a very long history, as a matter of fact, the whole history of the prison that goes back to the beginning, the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s, it was always contested. So there were challenges to the notion of prison being the most effective way to address social harm. There have been those questions from the beginning, and they also related to debates around the death penalty, because the death penalty was connected to the carceral approaches. But more recently, it was the Attica brothers in 1971 who seriously raised abolition, and who, in their uprising, pointed out that these institutions are going to have to be eliminated. And it's so interesting that if you go back and look at the op-eds during that period, articles that people wrote, books, there was a robust discussion of abolition in the early 70s. And it came directly from prisoners. Wow. So, I want to make that point, because oftentimes we think, oh, it's an academic idea. Now we have this academic field that's called critical prison studies, that is an abolitionist field, but that was largely initiated by prisoners. And so those who want to talk to people in the community should remember that, that they can find ways to engage in those conversations. And most people are relatively smart. It's these elitist institutions of higher learning that persuade people that once they get the education, that they've become a part of the elite, and therefore they're no longer connected to those they left behind in their communities. And so many people think, well, I can't talk to my family anymore. I can't. Of course you can. You just don't use the technical language that the technical vocabulary that you've learned in a particular field. Mm-hmm. And you figure out other ways to say it. You don't just assume that you have to use the specialized vocabulary. If you have to use that specialized vocabulary, it means you don't really understand. And you can't convey it to other people.
Right. Which is a skill. I mean, that is truly the test of being able to translate from, like you said, the technical terms to a way that anyone can understand what
Absolutely.
You're saying. Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty powerful. One question about globalization. How do you see anti-Black racism transcending globally? And what is our responsibility? The student wants to know, what is our responsibility and how are we to concern ourselves with the way that it exists outside of our country?
Well, that's a very important question. And I think that it's anti-Black racism, but it's also other forms of racism. It's Islamophobia. It's anti-Indigenous racisms. And I think that the fact that people all over the country rose up in response to George Floyd's murder. As a matter of fact, there was a demonstration in Palestine. And that connection with Palestine and the Black Lives Matter movement is really important because it was the Palestinians in 2014 who were at the forefront of an international solidarity movement with Black Lives Matter back then. But of course, all over the world, there's racism. I say all over the world because colonialism has affected every single spot on the planet. Colonialism and slavery. Colonialism, slavery, capitalism. Capitalism is racial capitalism. It was constructed on the foundation of colonialism and, of course, slavery. So that in places like France, there's a developing movement. The police kill Black people. There's a case of Adama Traore, who is from Senegal, and his sister Assa Traore is leading this amazing anti-racist movement, this movement against racist state violence in France. And in Brazil, where there are more Black people than anywhere else except on the continent, their problem with racist police violence is even vaster than ours. Thousands of Black people are killed by the police every year in Brazil. And as a matter of fact, when Marielle Franco, this queer Black activist and an elected official in Rio, when she was assassinated two and a half years ago, it was by a former police officer. And so, I think it's important for us here in this country to try to contextualize the work we do in a global context, and to recognize that there are struggles unfolding in Africa, South Africa. South Africa still has a major problem with its police, even though the police are now Black. Under apartheid, they were white. Mm-hmm. But the racist structures have remained, and it is Black police who are the actors, Black police who are killing Black people. The continent of Africa, I think it's so important to challenge Islamophobia because Islamophobia has changed the character of racism in many ways. It's responsible in many ways for the militarization of the police here, the so-called war on terror, and the need for counterinsurgency training, and the fact that Israel trains police departments in the US, including that move that Derek Chauvin used on George Floyd. So we can't understand the racism, and we certainly can't develop strategies to eliminate it unless we look at it within a global context.
Thank you. I tell you, I feel so much smarter by listening to you. This has been a wonderful, wonderful evening. I'm sorry there's so many more questions. I apologize to the audience that we couldn't get to all of them. Professor Davis, Dr. Davis, thank you so much for spending time with us. You have really shined a light on so many important topics for us tonight. And as I said, we're going to continue in the struggle. And I hope next time you can actually come to DC on campus, and we can entertain you and host you on campus. But thank you for tonight.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is it possible to save the questions that are asked on Zoom?
Yes, I think we are recording it, and I think that we will save the questions. Would you be willing to look at the questions?
I would love to see the questions.
Oh, wonderful.
Absolutely. And I'd like to thank everybody who answered, who asked a question. I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to address them, but I certainly would like to see them, and I can address them in other venues.
Thank you for that. And we'll get the questions to you. I think the others, I think from KPU have them, so we'll be sure to get them to you.
Wonderful.
Thank you again. Thank you to everyone out there, and I can't think of a better way to kick off our speaker series. Thank you, Dr. Davis. This has been a real joy. You have brought us so much joy by talking with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll sign off.
All right.
Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Sounds good. Okay, there's only like 8 of us left, but thank you guys for tuning in. I'm just going to like stay on Zoom for like 2 more minutes. Like if anyone has any questions, and if nobody has any questions, then please feel free to have a wonderful night. And I'll see you guys either at the print meeting next Thursday or at our next general meeting in 2 weeks.
I had a question.
Abby, quick question. What ice cream are you eating?
It's chocolate chip cookie dough.
Beautiful.
Almond milk.
Yes. Jordan, what was your question?
Oh, I was just wondering, how do you cite like sources when you're writing an article?
So the way that we typically do it is, let me share my screen and I'll actually show you. Okay. Where is our website? So usually, oh my God, we hyperlink things. And it'll show, like if you watch the how-to videos on our like member resources page, and that's linked in our newsletter and in the Facebook group if you don't have access to it. And it'll show you like how to hyperlink things on the website specifically, just so that you, oh, here's the website. I'm losing it. Just so that you can kind of see, okay, here's an article. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So like right here, like the pink means that there's like a source linked to that. And usually we do that like, oh, this should have been deleted. But usually we do that when we talk about like quotes or like direct information or like factual statistics and stuff like that like really do require a source, just so that we know where we get our information from. And so you can see all the pink here is how you hyperlink. And then at the bottom, we always put our sources and then hyperlink each number based on like where they are in the article. And then we put photos and then the Her Campus Media Library. Does that answer your question okay?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Of course, have a great night.
You too.